And now for a brief history of Vitis vinifera. Note that I said a history of Vitis vinifera, not a history of wine. That entails a whole nother slew of lectures, if not a course, unto itself. We just want to very quickly trace how did this one very specific subspecies of Vitis from a very specific place on planet Earth become prolific across the entire planet, at least the mid-latitude places, the temperate areas of the planet that can grow grapes. Any place that can grow grapes right now is growing this one species that's from a specific place 10,000 years ago. How did that come to pass? I do call Vitis vinifera the global traveler extraordinaire because it's a plant species that has talked humans into loving it so much that they've cared for it, cultivated it, and carried it to every inch of the planet that will grow it. And this is a travel that continues for Vitis vinifera as it's being pushed and proliferated into new places it's never even been. Quite a successful plant by any stretch of the imagination. Now, to recap, we're talking about one species called Vitis vinifera of the genus Vitis. There are tons of species, perhaps hundreds, all across the northern hemisphere, but virtually all the table wine you'll ever drink is from this one particular species that has subspecies or cultivars or varieties. You starting to remember these terms now? Things like Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Semillon, Gamay, Sangiovese. All these are different varieties, cultivars, or subspecies of this one species, Vitis vinifera. And they're all over the planet Earth, and they're all in the same family. Okay, how did they get from there to everywhere? But where did they start? How did they get from where to everywhere? This particular species called Vitis vinifera is from the Caucasus Mountain, or the Caucasus. The Caucasus or the Caucasus Mountain region, and that is the stretch of mountains from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. And they're fairly high mountains, by the way. High peaks of 20,000, 21,000, 22,000 feet, a forbidding range, we could say. They are kind of a natural human barrier, or I should say a biological barrier for movement across them. They're that high. And they're a political barrier as well, or a political line, I should say. These mountains are so tough, they really form the political line between Russia and the states to the south of Russia, namely Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Georgia, the country Georgia, not the state in the United States. And I pick on Georgia because it's extremely likely that Georgia is the place that the original Vitis vinifera came from. If not exactly from Georgia, from this general area, the southern flank of the Caucasus Mountain regions. Now, how do we know that? Because I've now told you this species is all over the planet Earth, and you can find remnants of it or find it actively growing all over planet Earth. So how do you know it's from here? How do we know it started here? Well, this map I'm showing you now has the shaded in gray areas are where there are current wild grapevine that is genetically, DNA, extremely close to all of the subspecies of Vitis vinifera that are grown all over the planet. That's for starters. More important than that is that archaeological evidence suggests that this specific species is from this place. And how could that be? How could you prove that a plant that was there 10 or 20,000 or 30,000 years ago and came from this particular place and not someplace else? Well, unlike most other organic materials like, say, tomato or bread or grains, those things rot and they go away, and there's no historical evidence of it. No archaeological evidence, I should say. However, when it comes to grapes, there's a couple different things that we can find in the ancient record, and they highly suggest that this was a grapevine / wine. And the two things are that the pips, the little seeds, we call them pips, are extremely resilient, as are some of the woody stems of grapevine, and they will actually fossilize. So there are fossil remnants of this particular fruit, and you can't, I think, I'm not a scientist, although I'd like to play one on TV, I think you can actually grind up the pips, even if they've been fossilized, and then genetically test them and unravel their DNA. Don't they do that stuff for dinosaurs? If they do, I think they're doing it for grapevine as well. And so they can, again, find ancient materials that are like, oh, wait a minute, this is a plant from 10 or 20,000 years ago that's extremely closely related to the stuff that we're calling Vitis vinifera today. Like genetically almost a match, just slight variations. And again, they can also make those comparisons with the wild grapevines that are still growing out in the forest and plains of today's Turkey and Georgia and Armenia. So there's a couple of different genetic paths that are tying it to, yeah, that plant they're growing over in France and in California and in Australia, genetically it's probably from these plants that have been here for a very long time, because we have archaeological evidence that suggests they've been here for a very long time. Just as important is that we can do chemical analysis now. And the chemical analysis that occurs with archaeologists who study this stuff is on pot shards, old clay amphora, clay vessels. We can just call them pots if you like. And years ago, they started detecting, hey, there's like this crystalline residue. And some pots have a red residue and some pots have a yellow residue. Huh. And, oh, maybe it's, vinegar they were storing, or yogurt or milk. But here's the thing. With today's equipment, you can actually test exactly what the stuff is. And they found extremely high levels of tartaric acid in a lot of these unearthed pots that are 6,000, 5,000, 4,000 years old. And when you start to put two and two together here, you have some pot shards of pots that contain some sort of liquid, because this is the residue of it, and it has really high levels of tartaric acid. Only one fruit on planet Earth has levels this high. Can you guess what it is? Grapes. You know this already from the previous lecture. So we have some genetic DNA ties to this particular place, and then pots that have been found all across the ancient world that certainly, and I don't even think it's up for question, certainly had tons of wine in it, because they have found lots of these things. This isn't a random pot here or there. No, there have been Egyptian tombs and storehouses and production facilities with hundreds of amphora or clay pots, or even the thousands of them that contain this liquid. Naysayers who don't like wine or don't like alcohol may say, well, they were just storing grape juice. Wrong, sir. Wrong. Because grape juice in the ancient world would have spontaneously fermented into wine. And it wasn't milk either, because it would have spoiled and it wouldn't have the same chemical residue. So in my mind, it's a done deal. Yes, we can find archaeological remains of this plant. We can also find chemical remains of wine that's been made from this plant. And yes, we're pretty sure, we're solid 90 to 95% sure that this particular species, which has been cultivated ever since for wine production, comes from the southern flanks of the Caucasus Mountains, probably in modern day Georgia. There's lots of people doing lots more research, and they will continue to do that and pinpoint things even further. Back to this map though, shaded in areas in gray are where modern wild grapevine, very genetically close to Vitis vinifera, exist. The little symbols that are grape cluster symbols are where you have fossilized evidence of stems and pips. And the little clay pot symbols are where they've had archaeological digs that have found significant amounts of pots containing residues of tartaric acid, and only wine will do that. You starting to see this all coming together? Well, let's put some times on this then. The period that we're talking about for the grape clusters is about 8,000 BC. Sorry, 8,000 BC. The pottery shard stuff, depending on which site in what country, and some of these things have been found in Iran, modern day Iraq, modern day Jordan, modern day Israel, modern day Egypt. And the dates on those things go from 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 BC. What's up with the timeline of that? Well, I don't know if you know your human story and this thing called the Neolithic Revolution. Again, I don't like to hit you too heavy with history and science, but the Neolithic Revolution is when us human types did a radical transition from being hunter-gatherers to being more settled down, sedentary agriculturalists. And once we started becoming a farmer, instead of being hunters, we started staying in one place and becoming farmers. And shortly after that, we started congregating in villages that become towns, that become cities, that become empires, that whole civilization thing. So the Neolithic Revolution is about 10,500 or 11,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. There's no exact dates on this. Call it 8,000 to 10,000 years ago is when this transition starts to take place. Now, what else is happening in this transition? Hunter-gatherers, probably with very little reservation, were hunting and gathering things like grapes and grains and hunting animals, but grapes was probably in the fray. And again, we can't prove any of this. This is pre-writing, pre-civilization pre-writing. But this is when people, probably these hunter-gatherer types, were selecting berries and grains and animals that they like to eat. And we'll stick with the grapes for reasons that we'll never know. Apparently lots of humans in this ancient world, in this part of the ancient world, really liked this one species called Vitis vinifera. Really liked it. Was it because it had better flavors? Perhaps. Maybe it was bigger fruit? Perhaps. Maybe it had more sugars? Perhaps. Maybe it was a combination of all those things, which is likely. So for a multitude of reasons, of all of the wild grapevine that was all over the place, and again, wild grapevine would have been from today's Great Britain all the way through to China, and over in the Americas, but there's no humans over here yet. Actually, yeah, they would have been, but let's stick with the Eurasian story. Of all the hunter-gatherer action that was happening in the world, only this group of hunter-gatherers from this particular part of the planet really liked these particular grapes enough to start to want to cultivate them intentionally and grow them once the Neolithic Revolution transition took place. So people might have been eating grapes all over the world 20,000 or 50,000 years ago, but only these people from this place, once they started settling down and growing food, picked this one species and said, no, all the other species that exist around here, they're okay, but this one's the best. So we're going to intentionally start planting that. And again, we're looking at the intentional planting and settling down in humans is 8,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago is specifically for this Fertile Crescent area that we're talking about on planet Earth. Other civilizations were occurring in China and the Americas and other places. But these are the guys that started doing the grapes, which is why it's part of our story. Now, the other date that I would tack in that you should know is about 6,000 BC. And that's because all this other stuff was happening and people were settling down and picking these particular grapes. And by the way, they were picking barley out, specific species of barley to plant to make into beer and bread. But Vitis vinifera is in this fray of things that were being picked intentionally to be planted. And 6,000 BC is important because that's when this great innovation called pottery pops up. Now, I believe, and many archaeologists who study stuff like this also believe it, that it's very likely that people were making alcohol even pre-Neolithic Revolution. But it would have been very quick. They would have picked some grapes and smashed them in a little rock crevice and drank it, within a few days or weeks because it would have spoiled and gone bad. When you invent pottery, whoa, now you got a whole nother world open to you because you can store this wine and maybe seal it up and preserve it for a little bit longer, and you can transport it distances. And pots leave archaeological evidence that we can find, get out the residue and say, oh no, people were making wine and this stuff. So that's the time frame for when people started picking this specific species out. Why here, though? Why did they do it here and not in Central Europe or in Italy or in China? Well, as we've suggested, there are lots of different species of grapes all over planet Earth. This one, Vitis vinifera, happened to be growing here. So it's the OG, it's the original area that this specific species was from. It also was facilitated by the fact that this is where Western civilization started. So you've heard ancient Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent, old Bible stories. You've heard of some of this stuff, right? This is the area that humans start the first full-on civilizations that crop up the first big empires and things of that nature. All of that is happening in a place that happens to have that species. If the first early civilizations had occurred in North America instead of here, maybe we wouldn't be drinking Vitis vinifera. But the first, especially Western civilizations, did start here, and they did use this exact plant material to make this awesome beverage called wine. And of course, they are going to attach cultural and social values to this product called wine and give it religious implication and symbology. And it's kind of a tougher commodity to grow because remember, you can grow grain, and grain's awesome because it will last. You can store it. You can grow it now, and then in the wintertime, you can grind it up and make bread or beer. Grapes, on the other hand, they'll rot. So and it's a little more time and labor intensive to grow grapes. And it requires a bit more knowledge and when you should pick them, what you should do, and all these other things. That makes wine more special, more rare. Everybody drank beer forever. Wine was more special and more expensive because it was tougher and it was very seasonal based and you had to drink it now or have the technology like some pots in order to store it, but even that would only get you 3 or 4 months. So it's a more expensive commodity. Why would I bring that up? Because that starts to build into the whole culture of wine of who gets to drink wine? Who gets to drink the expensive stuff? Who gets to have the expensive stuff, even in today's world? The upper classes, the rich, the super wealthy, the aristocracy, the kings, the queens, their court. It's used for religious rituals, so the priestly class. This is why wine, very early on, gets special status. It's an elevated status. The special people drink it, and it's used by the kings and the priests, the important people. But I digress, because that's now getting back into the history of wine. Let's get back to just the history of Vitis vinifera. Because of its demand early on, because of some of the stuff I just talked about, Mesopotamia, ancient Western civilization, becomes a big market for it. Now, it's grown up in the Caucasus Mountains, the Taurus Mountains, which is the mountainous area of today's Turkey, grown in the Zagros Mountains, which is the mountainous area between Iraq and Iran, or mostly in Iran now, in areas a little cooler. The Vitis vinifera plant really didn't grow that well in what's Mesopotamia. That's the lower valley area between the Tigris and Euphrates. You've heard this stuff, right? Ancient civilization? Because it's hotter and lower and muddier. So but that's where civilization starts and where empires start. And so there very quickly evolves a wine trade using Vitis vinifera grapes to produce wine that becomes expensive, which becomes a big trade thing down in Mesopotamia. And people figure out pretty quickly as civilization spreads over to areas that we'll later call Phoenicia and Israel and Egypt and the kings of Egypt and all that stuff, people figure out within these trade routes of, well, why are we going to transport this stuff all the way from the Caucasus Mountains down to the Levant or modern-day Sinai Peninsula? Why don't we just put the plant down here? Back to the proliferation of the plant. So as this commodity increases in desirability and honestly just economic wealth, people say, hey, well, let's take that plant and plant it down here. We're going to plant this plant over here. And it is moved from wherever its source origins were in the Zagros, Caucasus, Taurus mountain areas of Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Iran. It's moved from there down into not Mesopotamia proper, but the Jordan River Valley, which is in modern-day Israel, and then moved down into the Sinai Peninsula, which is modern-day Egypt. And we, again, have archaeological and some pot residue evidence to suggest it was in modern-day Israel by 4000 BC. So where it started, 8 or 10,000 BC. Wine trade develops, moves down to the Levant in 4000 BC. It is in Egypt, and when I say it now, I'm talking about Vitis vinifera, the plant. People transplanted it down to ancient Egypt definitely by 3000 BC, because there's a big wine culture that has very good evidence in ancient Egypt. And I should add in at this point, now we can start, by 3000, 4000 BC, we start to have now written records. We invent this thing called writing, even if it's on clay tablets with markings and stuff. And so we have evidence of the wine trade and the buying and selling of this product, and maybe even some information about how to grow or what to do, or manuals on how to grow. So people started to pass down information. That's how technology diffuses. Somebody comes up with a good idea and then it works and they spread those ideas. That still happens in today's world, and it happened with wine in the ancient world. And by the time it gets to Egypt in 3000 BC, there is great frescoes within the pyramids and the tombs of people producing wine. It's very specific. There are a couple different famous frescoes that show all of the processes of growing grapes and making wine a la fresco on the wall. And important people And priestly class and the kings and queens use it for religious ritual, and there's documentation of that. People saying, let's get wasted on wine so I can see the gods. And even the Scorpion King tomb, which was unearthed, I don't know, 100 years ago, had something to the effect of 300 or 400 clay amphora full of wine. Again, because of the residue, we know it's wine. So they're planting wine into the tombs of the famous people. You know how it works. The rich and famous get stuff even when they're dead. So wine is a big deal in the Mesopotamia all the way over to the ancient Egypt time period of ancient history. But that's over there. And we don't consider any of those places big wine producers in today's world. Georgia actually still produces some, but Egypt, no, not really. Jordan, no. Iran, Iraq, no. How did the plant then get everywhere else? Because the civilization action is going to move from the Middle East / Near East to the Mediterranean in short order. And as civilization spreads, so does Vitis vinifera, the plant material. So core area, let's call it, in the Caucasus Mountains, 5 to 6 to 7 to 8,000 BC. Down into the Mesopotamia wine trade by 5,000. Over into modern-day Israel by 4,000. Into ancient Egypt by 3,000. And then it's going to jump. And it's going to jump because of these folks that are starting to crop up that we're eventually going to call the Greeks. The vine actually makes it to Crete first, which is now a part of modern-day Greece, but it was its own kingdom back in the day. Wasn't that the Minoan civilization? Cool civilization. So they had it. There was these guys called the Phoenicians who were located in now the coastlines of, say, modern-day Israel and Lebanon. They had, and they were trading wine. So the vine itself makes it to Crete by about 2000 BC. We're still in the BCs, by the way. It starts to move across modern-day Turkey about the same time, but there was more trade and more movement over the seas than over land in the ancient world. It makes it to the Greek mainland by about 1500 BC. Now, let me stop the story right there for a second in the timeline. Yes, they're actually using this one plant, this one particular species, because we like it. Us humans like this, and people are making wine out of it, and we like the wine too. We like the grapes for what they can be made into with awesome wine. So they're actually taking the same genetic material. That's what I want to stress. They're not taking seeds, or they're actually taking cuttings and clippings and saying, hey, we really like this plant that's growing in, say, central Lebanon right now. Let's transplant that down to the Sinai Peninsula. And then people experiment and mess around with it there, and it mutates a little bit, and it does something different in Egypt. They go, oh, I really like that one. Let's take that one over to Crete. Say the people from Crete say, hey, we really like these wines. We're going to import these particular vines from these particular places and try to grow them here. So you have the actual genetic code from one species that keeps getting moved quite intentionally. And then I start the story back up where I left off with these guys called the Phoenicians and the Greeks. They're really important to the Vitis vinifera story because they were Mediterranean-based civilizations. That's awesome in and of itself because the Mediterranean rocks. More importantly, they were seafaring peoples on the Mediterranean. Okay, what's that got to do with anything, Boyer? Why are we learning this history lesson? I wanted to learn about why. Stay with me because it's cool. The Phoenicians, for those of you that know your history, are a group of folks who go out on boats and explore the Mediterranean and open up trade routes and start trade routes. And they also start city-states. Sister cities, if you want to call them. So when the the Phoenicians row out into the Mediterranean, and they went as far as the Atlantic Ocean and up the west coast of what's now Portugal and Spain, maybe even to Great Britain. Back in the day, we're talking several thousand years ago, when they were going out, they would set up little cities as their trade colonies. What's so important about that? Well, because you take the stuff that you like from your culture and you transplant it into your new city that you're starting in Libya, in Tunisia, in southern Spain. And what do you take with you? You take the animals you like to eat, you take the grains you like to grow, and you take the grapes that you want to make into wine. So the Phoenicians, this group you've probably at least heard of tangentially by name, they actually become later in history the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians settle and kind of take over the whole north coast of Africa including southern Spain and what's now Portugal, and they are transplanting Vitis vinifera to all these places over the course of a couple thousand years. On to the Greeks. They do the same thing, but mad more. So the Greeks are also a seafaring peoples, a maritime culture. They like to trade, and they like to set up sister city-states all over the Mediterranean. And this map that I've been showing you, by the way, the little red numbers are ancient Greek city-states all across the Mediterranean, and the ones in yellow are Carthaginian city-states set up all across the Mediterranean. Both of these cultures being maritime cultures that do city-states and consume wine, move the vine to all these places all across the Mediterranean. This is why I'll go back to the timeline now. Vitis vinifera is in Greece by about 1500, 1600 BC. They start moving it to other places, so it gets to southern Italy and Sicily by about 800 BC. That's right. Vitis vinifera is not from Italy. Italy, one of the most prolific wine-growing areas of planet Earth for the last 2,000 years, the plant ain't from there. It's from Georgia. And the Greeks are the ones that took it to Italy. So it's not till about 800 BC, it gets to places like Sicily, southern Italy, Corsica, gets to Marseille, which is modern-day France, by about 600 BC, into Spain, the east coast of Spain by 800 BC, and possibly all the way over into the west coast of Spain and Portugal about the same time. So these two groups of folks really do a lot to kind of litter the entire Mediterranean littoral, that is the coastlines, with this very one specific species that we keep pointing out. And I should also note that unlike in the ancient world of Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, where only special people drank the commodity because it was super expensive, by the time you get to the Phoenicians, who by the way weren't around that long, and the Carthaginians, who were around a little bit longer than that, and the Greeks in their heyday, by the time these civilizations are rolling high, everybody drinks wine. Everybody drinks wine. Babies are fed wine for breakfast. Old people drink it right before they die. And in every social class and caste, including slaves, everybody drank wine. Now, why would I point that out? Again, that's more of a wine history than a Vitis vinifera story. It's just important because of this. This is a huge economy of scale by this point. So 2000, 1500, 1000 BC, everybody drinks wine in all of the civilizations of the Mediterranean, and they drink a lot of it. And when you have a commodity that everybody wants and drinks daily, then you have to have a lot of vineyard to support that. They say back in the day that the Italian peninsula was just covered, north to south, east to west, that the whole thing was one damn vineyard. Because you had cities like Rome, which may have had its peak, I don't know, like 1 million citizens who needed wine. That's a lot of people who need wine, and so you need a lot of vineyard to sustain that, which is another reason why the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and then later the Romans are going to go conquer more territory as a food source. And again, they're going to transplant the foods they want there to feed their populations back in their major cities. And wine is a part of that the whole time. That's why I'm telling you about a little wine culture back in the day. They really, because of the demand, Vitis vinifera gets pushed into every crack and crevice along the Mediterranean that it will grow in order to meet said demand. I will also take a TV timeout now to tell you, please keep in mind that I taught you in the last couple lectures that Vitis vinifera is the Mighty Morpher, meaning it will mutate sporadically, and it will adapt and adopt in different climates / biomes / microclimates. So keep in your mind, as these ancient civilizations to more modern civilizations are moving this species all over the place, it's changing at the same time. It's not going to grow the same in southern France as it was in central Georgia, as it was in the Nile River Valley of Egypt, as it was in any Greek city-state, say around the Black Sea. So you could take the same plant, and the Greeks did, and move it around all over the place, and over hundreds of years, it's going to change. And it's going to become a Sangiovese over here and a Merlot over there. Are you with me? Are you with me? Are you with me on understanding why there's so much variation in this one species? Because it's being put all over the place. Okay, TV timeout over, back to the history timeline, and I can actually accelerate it a bit now because we're getting into modern history more that you understand. The Greeks go away. They have Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire for a while, and they push the vine actually into Central Asia, but I'm not going to go in that direction. I'm going to stay over here. Let's pick it up with the Romans, who take over from the Greeks. And the Romans, of course, have even a bigger empire than any Greek city-state collaboration ever did, much less the Carthaginians. So the Roman Empire, when it gets large and in charge, what does it do slightly different? It takes over all the Mediterranean coastline and all that vineyard production that's happening, but it also presses north. And Rome becomes the entity that, at its height, expands Europe proper from the Mediterranean northward. So Rome takes over what's now Great Britain and what was Gaul, what's now France, and all of the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain and Portugal, and even up into places of now Romania and Bulgaria and Switzerland, and parts of what's now Germany. Put that thought aside for 1 second. And, because now I'm just telling the same story, as the Romans take over more Central and Northern Europe, they take the products they want with them to supply those small towns and army garrisons along the way, and army people are paid in wine, or at least they don't want wine, and grain and salt. So you need those things in all the places you go, so you take grain and grape and you plant it everywhere. What grape do you take and plant everywhere? Vitis vinifera is the grape you take and plant everywhere. So it's the Romans that actually move into, and I'll just stay with Gaul, and by the 1st century AD and even 200 AD, or actually probably go backwards to 100 to 200 BC, it's the Romans that start to permeate modern-day France and take Vitis vinifera into all these areas that in today's world we just assume have always Burgundy and Bordeaux, they must have always grown grapes. Nope, Romans took it there. And even in parts of southern Great Britain, the Romans took vines over there and planted there as well. And I want you to now take Germany back off the back burner, which is always a dangerous thing to do. See World War I and World War II. Take Germany back off the back burner because Germany produces a lot of wine in today's world. Not compared to France, but they're a wine player top 10. How in the heck did this plant get from Georgia to Deutschland, an area that's pretty far north and fairly challenging for this plant to grow in? The answer was all the story I've told you up to this point, specifically the Roman part. The Romans are pushing into what's now southwestern Germany back in the day and fighting barbarians and setting up, forts for the army garrisons to be camped out in. And right behind the front wall of the Roman defense is where people start to plant grain and grapes and start making wine. When you look at the map of today's Germany, all of the modern wine regions of Germany today, you can draw a line around them, and that line is where the Roman Empire expanded into Germany 2,000 years ago and planted Vitis vinifera. Isn't it exciting? Sorry, I know you might be terribly bored by all this, but I love it. And again, to stress, Germany's way different than southern Spain. So you're taking the same species and putting it in a really cold place and a really hot place, and add in several hundred to 1,000 years of experimentation, and the Vitis vinifera is different in Germany than it is in central Spain, than it is in central Italy. Starting to get the bigger picture here. So back to our Roman story. As the empire expands, so does viticulture, so does the spread of Vitis vinifera, setting the stage really for the wine regions of Europe today. It's at this point, again, a full almost 2,000 years ago, that Vitis vinifera, this plant species, makes it into all of the modern wine regions that we identify as the classic wine growing regions of Europe in today's world. They also start using barrels, by the way, but I'll do another whole lecture on barrels. The Romans are the ones that said, hey, it's hard to transport clay pots across the Alps. Let's put it in something a little tougher, namely a wooden barrel. More on that later. The other thing I would now add to the story of Europe becoming the cradle of wine growing, of Vitis vinifera, is that Europe at the same time becomes the cradle for this world religion we call Christianity. And Christianity uses wine, right? Part of its sacrament, part of its ritual, So as Christianity spreads, the use of wine spreads. And that's not so important for Europe because I've now pointed out that wine is already moving all across Europe because of all these different empires. But the church, namely the Catholic Church, in all of these countries you now recognize in today's world, like Germany and France and Spain, the church is a big user of wine, and so they start to become a steward of wine, literally, in terms of keeping records and writing books on viticulture and Vitis vinifera itself and how to make wine. They really become a repository for knowledge throughout the ages, including the Dark Ages. And I mostly wanted you to understand that Christian component because Europe, cradle of wine, cradle of Vitis vinifera, cradle of Christianity, and Europe and Christianity are going to spread. That gets us back to the spread of Vitis vinifera. How does it get to the rest of the world? Because the Europeans loved wine. The Christian Europeans so loved their wine that when they kick into the Renaissance and then into the age of discovery and launch world globalization and world domination, they are the ones who then take Vitis vinifera, this very specific plant, out to the rest of the planet. I like to use this graphic in lots of different classes, but this is the heyday of Western European colonialism, and all of those countries lit up in purple, that little handful, 6 or 7 or 8 countries, who all happen to be wine-producing countries, they end up taking over, colonizing, or outright owning all of the countries of the world lit up here in pink. Isn't that an awesome graphic that tells you a whole bunch? What's it got to do with Vitis vinifera? Because they take Vitis vinifera with them as they're conquering the world. And just to put a few dates on the timeline here, we get Vitis vinifera being taken by folks like Vasco da Gama and Portuguese explorers after him, and Christopher Columbus and explorers after him. They take it to what's now South Africa by the 1650s. Over into Australia by the 1790s and 1800s. Of course, the Brits and the Frenchies also go colonize, and the Spanish colonize the Americas. So the Spaniards get Vitis vinifera into what's now the Caribbean and even into Mexico by the 1520s. Now, of course, Vitis vinifera don't grow that good in the Caribbean, so it ain't there, but it did flourish in Mexico and up the California coast by the 1770s and 1780s. The Brits and the Frenchies tried to grow along the eastern seaboard of the United States, so they were bringing over Vitis vinifera into Virginia, into Florida, into Massachusetts in the early 15 and 16, or the mid 1500s to early 1600s. It even went down the west coast of South America. The Spaniards had a thriving wine industry in places like modern-day Peru in the 1530s and 1550s, all the way down into Chile by 1550. So you add it all up and you're like, oh, okay, now I get it. The Europeans, and in general, we could say more specifically, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the Brits, who ended up taking over huge chunks of planet Earth. They are the ones that were that second or third wave of taking this plant material all over planet Earth into what we call the New World wine regions. As they colonized, they also made these places into wine production areas. Some of those areas, of course, took hundreds of years to become wine-producing areas. But again, this is a story of the plant material, and the plant material has been moving virtually nonstop now for 8,000 to 10,000 years, and really in overdrive in the last 400 years since Europe's age of colonization, where they moved it to the rest of the parts of the planet that this species had not gotten to yet. So, think about this in summary now. A plant from the Middle East, a plant from modern-day Georgia, which is the Near East/Middle East, explodes into the Mediterranean, explodes across the ancient world 8,000 years ago, gets into Egypt 3,000 years ago, gets into the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago, explodes across all of Europe. I'm sorry, let me back it up. Explodes into Egypt 3000 BC, explodes into the Greek and Phoenician world by 1500 BC, and then explodes across Europe, particularly under the Romans, a couple thousand years ago. And now Europe is the place that we most think of when we think of wine, even though the plant's not originally from there. And why is that? Well, because they embraced it big time as part of their diet, part of their culture, part of their religion. They have now had a couple thousand years of experimentation situating different grapes to the best sites to bring out the best flavors for those particular wines. Certain vinifera grapes, certain subspecies, right, of Vitis vinifera, like cuisine across Europe, evolved from what each community, village, town did best with their biome or their terroir, right? Which is why, and again, the plant keeps morphing. So over 2,000 years, even within Italy, they said, oh, well, we grow this, oh, mamma mia, we grow the vinifera up here, and 1,000 years later, we call this strand of Nebbiolo. And down here in Tuscany, this is Sangiovese, and no one grows Sangiovese like we grow Sangiovese because it evolved here. And even in parts of Tuscany, one side of Tuscany grows one type of Sangiovese, the other side grows another, and they say, well, there's enough mutated variation to make these two different grapes altogether. Now you're really starting to split hairs and split genes, but that's how the plant morphs. That's how it's evolved into thousands of subspecies and become famous within certain areas of Europe who have a long lineage of growing these. A long tradition becomes established with certain grapes in certain areas at certain times that pair with a cuisine, right? Does that make sense? So that's why Tuscany has their specific subspecies of vinifera and the wines that they make from it that are very much theirs and their identity, which is why in the Old World, or Europe as we call the Old World wines, wine is an expression of their place. They say, this Vitis vinifera that we've grown here, that evolved here, this is ours. This is ours. Sangiovese is eminently Tuscany. No one else in Europe really grows it. It's theirs. Pinot Noir is eminently Burgundy. They're famous for this one subspecies of this plant because over time these things have evolved out. Does that start to make sense? It's back to that concept called terroir that I told you about. That unique expression of each place will bring out unique flavors from this particular plant material. So the Old World wines come from the classic winemaking regions of Europe, and the New World wines come from every place else. Every place outside of Europe is officially counted as the New World wines. Even places like China, which are older than Europe, right? And just a finish-up word on the New World. The New World, having only experimented with Vitis, only been introduced to and experimented with Vitis vinifera for a few hundred years, some places less than that, they don't have the history. They don't have the history of experimentation. They haven't really evolved out figuring out which grapes grow best in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia versus the Napa Valley of California. Some places are a little further ahead, but so much experimentation is occurring across the New World that it's hard to pinpoint. Places that have been growing certain vinifera for a while, yeah, they've got their history down. We'll go back to Napa or Sonoma County. Yeah, they grow really good cabs out in California. They grow really good Zinfandels. But they're experimenting with everything else. They originally took the exact plant material from Europe. Let's pick up a Pinot Noir cutting from Burgundy and transplant it over to Virginia and Australia and California. And they basically tried to make wines that mimic the style of the European wines that they're used to. And they've been only going at it for a couple hundred years trying to figure out, this Burgundy and this Pinot Noir in Central Virginia doesn't work. This isn't so good. But this other one, Cabernet Franc, someone experimented with that in Virginia, and it's really good because this subspecies morphed slightly and does something different in Virginia. It doesn't taste like this anywhere else. That's the fun of Vitis vinifera and why people are still experimenting here in the 21st century with figuring out, maybe we can grow a Sangiovese in Florida. Maybe we could do a Cabernet Sauvignon in Switzerland. Everybody's trying lots of stuff. And that's the bottom line. Whether it's Old World or New World, everyone on the planet is using this one specific species of Vitis vinifera that is now, because of morphing and experimentation and movement across the planet, evolved out into thousands of different varieties or cultivars. And the experimentation has not stopped. China's trying everything they can do. India's planting stuff all over the place. Places that have never ever even attempted to grow Vitis vinifera know that this is such a big market and that the plant will morph, and maybe they can make a wine there that's very unique to, say, Morocco. People are trying it. So that's why I finish on, man, this plant has a fascinating history and has to be considered one of the most successful plant species of all time because it is continuing to be pushed into areas all across the globe. Speaking of which, how do you grow this stuff? And what's going on in the vineyard physically to make this grape happen into something we're going to turn into something called wine? We should probably cease and desist on this history lecture and get back into the vineyard now.